Okay, good evening. Welcome to this Experiencing the Buddha's Teaching series. And we are now in the module of the Four Noble Truths. And I'm Wai Chong. So we have been looking at, good evening everyone. Yeah, I'm looking at, last week we looked at happiness. So I gave a subtitle, The Pursuit of Happiness. Four Noble Truths is a very famous teaching in Buddhism, reputed to be the first teaching by the Buddha. And so, of course, it starts off as famously with the Noble Truth of suffering. Last week I thought we can maybe start a bit differently, start with happiness, because they're related. And just to review or just to remind you a little bit what we touched on last week, which is the first session of this module. I presented, I think, 5 different types of happiness, some of which we have looked at in previous module. Happiness of sensual pleasure, which is probably one that we all can relate to. During this period of time with lockdown, the internet is like a savior. We watch all sorts of things on the internet, and those are sensual pleasure coming to us through sight, through sound, right? And of course, working from home or stuck at home. And the other sensual pleasure would be, of course, eating, food. Now that those of us in New South Wales, the restaurants are open again. Of course, we immediately head out to the restaurants. Oh, we are blessed. Well, that's good. Good to know that we are blessed. Well, I'm quite glad that I don't have to keep eating my own cooking. Yeah. So anyway, those are happiness of sensual pleasures. The next is the happiness of traditionally it's called blamelessness. This feeling of freedom from blames, from regrets. It has to do with living our life in an ethical way. I also quite often equate that with living our life in a meaningful way, in a purposeful way, following our own ethical principles. Yeah. So there's the happiness of blamelessness, or happiness of ethical conduct. Then there's the happiness of loving connection, which is a heartfelt connection of kindness and compassion with others. And the fourth one is the happiness of meditative absorption, which is the special kind of happiness that comes to us as we enter into deep states of meditation. So all of these 4, we can consider them conditional types of happiness, because they very much rely on conditions, especially quite often on external conditions. And I contrast that with the 5th type of happiness, the happiness of freedom from suffering, or also called happiness of liberation in Buddhism, which is different from the previous 4. And we can look at the teaching of Four Noble Truths as a teaching or presentation of the happiness of freedom from suffering. And it's an interesting way of looking at it, this particular type of happiness. Sometimes I don't even consider it happiness. I tend to imagine it as a state of deep peace, to be at ease and at peace with ourselves in this moment, or whatever it is that's happening in our life. And to appreciate that kind of the release from suffering and the causes of suffering, from the turmoil of suffering, to find that sense of peace instead of being caught up in the turmoil, is how I tend to imagine this particular type of happiness, and which is the main focus of the teaching of Four Noble Truths. And today we're going to go into greater details, looking at the very first Noble Truth. And Previously, I did gave a few analogies that the Buddha presented in the discourses to help us get a sense of what is this happiness like. So those are just analogy, not the actual state of unconditional peace or nirvana. Is actually the Sanskrit word for this particular type of happiness of freedom from all suffering and the causes of suffering. And just to recap a little bit or remind ourselves, so that kind of happiness is similar to the relief we may feel if we have been imprisoned for a long time and then we are let out of jail. So the regaining of the freedom from physical confinement. Yeah. Maybe like lockdown, precisely. I mean, now we can really appreciate. We have a real life example of this sense of release. Another analogy would be the having pay off our financial debts. Therefore, there is this sense of relief from the burdens of the financial debts. And the last image would be one of full recovery from illness, especially one of those illnesses to sort of linger around that really severely affect our daily life. And finally, a day arrive when we suddenly recognize or realize that we have regained full health. We have regained all the energy, the freedom of movements to be able to do what we used to do, and that we have completely put aside the negative effect of the illness. So again, there is a kind of happiness that comes from that release. Yeah. So this is just some images, analogies to help us to get a sense of what we are pursuing or what we are looking into. So let's go into further details of this freedom from suffering. And of course, you're most welcome to post your comments or questions on the live chat. As I explained, after all these weeks, quite a few weeks already, I've been doing this live streaming. I was saying or telling people that I get so used to sitting in this empty meditation hall facing the webcam and just keep talking, basically talking to myself in a way. Yeah. So please feel free to interrupt me if you have questions or you have a comment. Yeah. So the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, is very famous. Even non-Buddhists would have heard about it. Yeah. And there's a few interesting things we can talk about. First is we can reflect a little bit, why on earth did the Buddha choose to start with suffering? I often joke that, and I don't think it's a joke, I think if we put on your book or a new book, or like we run a conference here at Vajrayana Institute, the Happiness and its Causes Conference. What happens if we were to switch the title and say suffering and its causes? Do you think it would be a very popular conference, or if it's a book title, will it be a very popular book? I mean, I don't know, but I think we do naturally gravitate towards the more positive labels, happiness. So why on earth did the Buddha so many years ago choose to begin his presentation with the topic of suffering? For me, I think it holds great significance, at least for myself. I came to Buddhism via meditation. I was looking for a way to guide my own meditation practice, a framework to frame and to understand what I'm trying to do with meditation. So after reading and thinking and testing out different spiritual traditions, I chanced upon Buddhism. And this presentation of the Four Noble Truths, starting with suffering, really resonates with me, because this maybe because I'm a pessimist. So I always start to think from the worst case scenario. So I thought, oh, this is right up my alley, don't talk about happiness yet. Let's talk about suffering. If first and foremost I'm able to free myself from suffering, so I get my bottom line covered, then I can build up on it. Isn't it wonderful? So I really like that idea, and I also think there's something deeper to beginning with suffering, because it is really getting at the goal of happiness from a different direction. Instead of one of acquiring or trying to hold on to what we perceive as the necessary conditions for us to be happy. I must have this, I must have that. Instead of approaching it from that way, approaching it from a point of negation. Is it possible for me to release myself, to free myself from things that are somehow holding me back or weighing me down, or literally sort of keeping me in a state of misery and unhappiness? How wonderful it would be if I can just somehow extricate myself, free myself from that. That in itself is a great accomplishment. So I think, and we will come back to this, why did the Buddha choose to start with suffering? It's an important question. So I hope when you have a chance, this evening while I'm talking, or afterwards, good to give some thoughts to how you personally perceive this way of starting or beginning the presentation of the spiritual path, starting with suffering. Okay, so let's look at how the Buddha describes suffering. Very famously, he starts off by listing 7 items. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, encounter with what is unwanted or unpleasant is suffering, separation from what we hold dear is suffering, and lastly, wishes, some of our wishes are unfulfilled, and that is also suffering. So quite a lot of suffering, isn't it? No wonder sometimes I have seen or read that people summarize it by saying life is suffering. Now, and I strongly disagree with that summary. In fact, I don't think anywhere you will find the Buddha, or at least the Buddhist teaching of First Noble Truth can be summarized or equate with this sentence or this statement, life is suffering. It's more like saying there is suffering in life, but life itself is not entirely suffering. And of course, I know no Buddhists who seems to take special delight, more delight than a pessimist like me in saying that life is suffering. Every single thing we can touch upon or talk about, we must view it as suffering. I'm not quite sure that is really the intent of the Buddha. And I will explain later why. So how do we understand this first list of 7 items? This repeatedly emphasizing each one of them is suffering. Does it mean that so long as we are aging, then it must be suffering? So long as we are afflicted by an illness, then there's no chance of happiness? And so long as we are subjected to death, then we can't possibly be happy. And that the fact that we do encounter things that we don't want, we don't like, that come across as unpleasant, then without any choice, we must suffer. Is that what this particular teaching is talking about? I think maybe not. No, I think by talking about it in this way, it's really a way of drawing our attention, inviting us to investigate what is suffering. So I like to present this and discuss this in relation to a very modern formulation of this answer to what is suffering. It's very modern because it's not something that you will find in the writing of Buddhist masters of the past or in the Buddha's discourse. But I think it's very relevant. I think quite a few people, Western teachers, Buddhist teachers, have summarized this First Noble Truth in a particular way, by way of a formula. Suffering equal pain multiplied by resistance. And by the word pain, you can think of it as a variable like X, like algebra. And in place of pain, you can insert in birth, insert in aging, insert in illness, death, and so on and so forth. And that multiplied by this thing called resistance equals suffering. And I find this formula fascinating. And recently, actually, I was discussing this with another group of Dharma friends. And someone recommended that I change the formula. Suffering equal pain multiplied by resistance raised to the power of 2. I mean, resistance squared. Which there's some reason why to do that. Yeah. What is this resistance? Resistance is our natural reaction when we encounter pain, or we encounter unpleasant situations, when we encounter illness, or confronted with the fact of aging. We resist that fact. How do we resist it? Various ways. We can deny it. We can choose to live in denial. Denial is a very common way of resisting. We can withdraw from it, which is sort of related to denial. We can actively oppose it, fight against it, and we can also resist by clinging to the very opposite of it. Let's say aging. So we can cling to whatever sign of youth that is significant to us. Then we cling to those signs of youth. For example, hair, right? For guys, especially, balding, and so you might cling to the fact that you really want to have hair, or even, and so then off you go searching for hair. When in my case, I'm trying to get rid of them. So those are different ways we resist. And so according to this formula, aging in itself as a fact of life is neither suffering or happiness. It's just something that happened to us. But if we are not able to see it that way, not able to relate to it as just a simple fact of life, and instead we usually unconsciously, it's not something we do consciously, we sort of instinctively, we resist it in different form. That resistance is what contributes to the experience of suffering. We really suffer over it. We suffer over aging. We suffer over our unpleasant encounter. We suffer over separation, over losses. We suffer over some unfulfilled dreams or wishes. Yeah. And I find that a wonderful way of understanding the First Noble Truth. And for me, it really resonates. It makes a lot of sense because I, reading the different discourses of the Buddha and about the Buddha's life story during the Buddha's lifetime, even after his enlightenment, for the 45 years of teaching he engaged in during this period of time, the Buddha himself encountered quite a lot of these few items. He, of course, encountered aging. So clearly being enlightened does not stop the aging process. You don't, in fact, you don't revert back to youth, right? So the Buddha, the historical Buddha, also aged. And he encountered losses, in fact, many losses. The most dramatic one is the loss of his own tribe, his own clan, when they were invaded by a neighboring kingdom. So the Buddha has taken an active step to try to stop the invading army, but eventually he failed. And so they entered into war. A lot of his clansmen and women were killed. Yeah. So there is a great loss. The Buddha also encountered times when wishes are unfulfilled. Like, for example, there's an incident of a schism, a split within the community, and the whole group of the different monastics chose to split into two, and they refused to listen to the advice of the Buddha. So there are all these different happening in his life, in the life of the historical Buddha. So how can I reconcile, because all these different happenings in the world, in the conventional world, we consider them suffering. So how can I say, or how can the Buddha claim that he was free from suffering, when he clearly have to face up to all these different happenings? So maybe we need to understand suffering and the freedom from suffering in a different way. It doesn't mean that with enlightenment or with liberation, we will never ever encounter anything unpleasant. We will never separate from whatever it is we hold dear. All our wishes will be fulfilled, every single one of them. And we won't have to age. We will never fall ill. And we definitely won't die. So, and clearly that's not true. Most of it happened to the Buddha himself as well as many of us. So suffering is better understood in this context, at least the way this word is used in the First Noble Truth, as the formula implied. Suffering equal to the variable, whatever conditions, whatever situations, pain, loss, aging. Sometimes it could be a happy incident also, yeah. But whatever it is, multiplied by resistance, when we resist the fact, when we resist the reality of this moment in one way or another, that resistance compounds or complicates the situation and becomes suffering. And by understanding in this way, then it also makes it very easy to understand the subsequent few noble truths. Immediately we know, without the resistance, suffering disappeared. Right? Okay, so that is an idea I thought I really invite you to think about. Feel free to agree or disagree. That is entirely up to you. But it's a way of approaching this topic of suffering in a way of making sense of, what does it mean in this case of suffering. It clearly doesn't mean freedom from suffering. Doesn't mean freedom from a lot of things or events that we naturally don't like. And it doesn't mean that with freedom of suffering in this context, we don't ever have to encounter that. So it's not like we will never age. Instead, our attitude towards aging, our response towards aging will be transformed. Whereas previously we resist it. Of course, each one of us resists in different ways and in different contexts. It brought forth different kind of reactions. But with liberation, with freedom, when we free ourselves from the causes of suffering, we release that resistance. We will be able to face up to these different facts of life and able to respond to them appropriately, and at the same time without having to suffer over them. And for myself, I find that this way of understanding it very attractive and very reasonable, and also most importantly, very doable, that it is very much available and accessible to us. It is something, not some fantasy or some state of, some ideal states that I cannot actually envision it coming true. I have to wait long time. But instead, it's something almost possible to actualize immediately. If not the high standard version, definitely able to actualize and experience what I call a low standard version of it. And that for me is very important, because that is very encouraging, very empowering. The teaching like the Four Noble Truths is not something that is just theoretical or something that can only be actualized by special people. No, special people, not by ordinary people like me who struggle a lot, which is far from perfection, which have a lot of strange thoughts and habits and bad habits and so on and so forth. But instead, it makes it so much more available to me, and which is why I study and practice Buddhism. I would really want to have a taste of that freedom from suffering, and more than a taste, if possible, to actualize it to much greater extent. Okay. So I've been sort of rambling on and on for a while. I wonder if there's any comments or questions from whoever is out there. So feel free to post it on the live chat. So basically, this idea: suffering equals pain or whatever situation multiplied by resistance. So do you think that is true or not? Yeah. And what would those resistance be? In the second Noble Truth, we would look at the Buddhist answer on the causes of suffering. But for today's life as a function of how you react, okay, life as a function of how you react. Well, I don't like this word function. It reminds me of my mathematics lessons in university. Function has a special meaning. Yeah. Of how you react. Definitely resistance. No worries. Resistance is, you can call it our reactions. We react to what is happening. We react to what we perceive. In this case, that reaction takes the form of resisting. Sometimes you can also use the word rejection. It's like this: what happens to us is like a fact of life, isn't it? Could be pleasant, could be unpleasant, could be neutral, but it is just plain fact. Yeah. I sprained I sort of hurt my tendon a few days ago. I just happened to twist my arm a bit wrongly, and then I feel something, and immediately I regret doing that. Yeah, so I've been feeling the pain for the last few days. So this is a fact. That is, I have somehow injured myself, and it feels very painful, unpleasant. I need to be mindful of how I use my right hand. I have to make adjustments in my life due to this temporary limitations. So this is the fact. Right? The fact by itself is just what it is. But of course, being human, we don't live it like that. We react to it. So we layer something on top of it. Like for example, I get upset with myself. This time I didn't get very upset with myself. I kind of just accept it and move on. And so in other words, I didn't resist too much the fact that I have, due to my own foolish mistakes, hurt myself. But other times I react much strongly and more persistently. I seems not able to just view it as a fact, a particular fact, and let it be, or just deal with it. Instead, there seems to be all this extra thing going on within myself in relation to that fact. And this is what we can call resistance. Right? Because one of the way we resist is to get angry. Right? In this case, I get angry at myself. Other times we get angry at other people. Anger can, in certain occasions, is our way of reacting to that situation, to that particular fact of life. And within anger, underneath anger, is you can think of it as a kind of a resistance, a rejection of that particular fact, or rejection of that particular situation or that particular treatment. Yeah. I think it's good not to think of it as right or wrong, but just think of it as this is what has happened, and to explore it a bit. Sometimes when we, if we jump to conclusion and immediately label that reaction as right or wrong, good or bad, that prejudgment can get in the way of us seeing things clearly. So because we have jumped to conclusion, then we are not able to attend to the details, what is actually happening. So that's one form of resistance that I definitely engage in. Another form of resistance could be what I previously talked about, craving, clinging. In meditation, sometimes I find myself in a nice place, wonderfully relaxed, pleasant, even very pleasant, and triggered by that increase in pleasure of meditation, the mind immediately react. It leaped forward. It wasn't even allowing itself to enjoy the pleasure that is happening here and now. Immediately reach forward and say, how can I get it back the next time? So, and then off it goes, starts to think about it. So that is yet another manifestation of resistance. It is trying, or at least my mind is trying to hold on to that pleasant experience. Not in this session, but immediately jumping to the next session in the future. So that is yet another way of we resist. Okay, so let me explain a way in meditation for us to explore this idea that I just present. Suffering equals whatever it is that's happening, that variable, multiplied by our resistance, and see whether we find it true or false. And the other way, of course, to look at it is, in the absence of resistance, is it still suffering? I have discomfort. I notice a discomfort in my shoulder. It feels very uncomfortable, very tight, maybe even painful, you might say. Now, if I don't resist that fact, if I don't tense up against it, if I don't get frustrated about it, if I don't get upset about it, if I don't sort of work myself up into a frenzy about why is it that I cannot relax my shoulder, if I don't engage in any of those kind of resistance or reaction, is that discomfort in my shoulder, which is unpleasant, is it still suffering? Or maybe it's just particular sensations that is happening to me in this moment. So that is something we can explore in our own experience through meditation. And this method of meditating is to employ mindfulness. Mindfulness in particular, according to a particular kind of acronym or protocol, which I've been presenting a lot lately, called the RAIN, RAIN. 4 letters represent 4 different aspects of mindfulness. R for recognize, A for acknowledge, I for inquire, N for nurture. So today, probably the first 2, recognize and acknowledge. Recognize means recognize the facts, the variable, what is happening in this moment. Recognize pain as a pain, discomfort as discomfort. Recognize can also be the opposite. A feeling of relaxation, a nice, pleasant feeling as nice and pleasant. Recognize the breath as the breath, in breath as in breath, out breath as out breath. Recognize the thoughts as the thoughts. I'm thinking. That is the fact. I'm thinking. Acknowledge is to fully accept that fact as the fact of this moment, to fully accept or acknowledge what is happening here and now as the reality of this moment. This is real, because this is what is actually happening to me in this very moment, here and now. And that is acknowledgement. Acknowledgement, of course, other people explain this letter A. Some people like the word accept, others use the word allow. I prefer the word acknowledge. For me, acknowledge is more matter of fact. I can like it or dislike it, but either way, all I need to do is simply acknowledge it. Acknowledgement does not imply that I must like it, because I can still dislike it, but nonetheless, I acknowledge it. I acknowledge that I hurt myself due to my own mistake. I acknowledge that whatever is happening, acknowledge that it's cold. I don't like it, but it's still cold, but that's the fact. Or if I feel very relaxed and calm, I can acknowledge I'm relaxed and calm, which I like. So liking and disliking aside, acknowledgement simply allowed me to face the facts of life as they are. Right? So first I must recognize what is happening, then I acknowledge it. So if we can pull off this tool in this next meditation, then we can say there is an absence of resistance. And then we can check to see, is this suffering? Or maybe not. Now, in place of acknowledgement, sometimes we can't acknowledge. Instead, we immediately leap into reactions. Leap into judgment is sometimes a kind of judgment, but judgmental attitude is part of resistance. This is wrong, this is bad, it must go away, shouldn't be here. No, I'm resisting the fact. Or, this should stay around. No, this should be always be here. No, I can't live without it. So there's yet another reactions. So in this meditation, we try to, by working with this tool, recognize, acknowledge, see whether it also heighten our awareness. There are many occasions in meditation actually that we can't just leave it as simple acknowledgement. We always sort of spill over to some kind of reactions. This is more likely the case when we are new to meditation, because we resist certain facts that we find in our meditation. For example, you find yourself very sleepy, and it doesn't gel well with your idea of meditation. I should be calm, awake, completely peaceful with no thought. So falling asleep or being very, very sleepy, falling asleep left, right, and center, simply just wouldn't do. It's just wrong. This shouldn't happen, must not be. And we might react to sleepiness quite strongly. We get very upset with ourselves, we feel very frustrated, we label it as a failure, or we say, it's completely useless meditation, or I just simply cannot stay awake, and therefore I will not meditate. So maybe all those reactions are part of our resistance to sleepiness, which is just a fact of life. I'm sleepy. Or even more likely, you may find yourself very agitated. You can't stop thinking about this, think about that. The mind is always all over the place. Instead of whatever it is you're trying to meditate on, do we resist that fact? And how do we resist it? And what does it mean to acknowledge, to recognize and acknowledge it? How does it feel like? Is there a difference? If I recognize that my thoughts, my mind is all over the place, and I acknowledge it, how does it actually feel like? Would you say patience is like a break to slow reaction? Patience as a break to slow reaction. I always think of patience as not as the cause, but as a result. In Buddhism, patience is an undisturbed mind. and I'm often disturbed. So I'm often impatient. I think of patience as not as a break to slow reaction. It's when I'm patient, reaction is already slowed down. So it's not so much the patience slow down my reaction, but by some way, I'm able to slow my reaction or not react at all. Then in that moment, I would say I am undisturbed and I am patient. So I'm using the word patience a little bit differently from how Craig is using it. Not so much as a cause, but as an effect. Whereas when I find my reaction is like zoom, 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 despite my best effort, then I know I'm impatient. I'm in a hurry to get somewhere, to achieve some result. And that's how I see either I'm patient or I'm not patient. I don't seem to be able to apply patience and slow it down. Instead of thinking of in terms of patience, I suggest you in this method of meditation, you simply apply those first two steps of mindfulness, recognize and acknowledge. And how do we do it? We do it through applying a simple label. And just be mindful of how we label our experience. Labeling means using a simple words and applying them, almost like tying a label onto that experience. So I'm going to suggest a few. I think we just use two simple words. One word is sensing. One label is sensing. Another label is thinking. Let's say. I mean, of course, if you feel very sleepy, you can use a third label, sleepy, or sleepiness, whichever. It doesn't really matter. Yeah. So, and what we're trying to do is, first of all, recognize what is happening. Am I sensing? Sensing means awareness through our physical senses, like listening, hearing sound, sensing bodily sensations like the breath, like tension, tightness, like relaxation, hardness, softness. So those are sensing. Yeah. And contrast that with another activity of the mind, thinking or sleepiness. Yeah. So I stick to thinking. Every time the mind, the attention is drawn away from the present moment, and we find ourselves engaged in some form of thinking activity, be it remembering the past or fantasizing, daydreaming, planning the future, or we just carry on an inner conversation, quite often involving judgments, judgmental, being critical. Then can we simply recognize that as thinking? And acknowledgement is when we apply the label. How do we say it? Do we say it as with a very calm, matter-of-fact tone of voice, just merely applying the appropriate label to what is actually happening? Sensing is sensing, thinking is thinking, just like that. And simply acknowledge the reality of that moment. Or do I use my label? I used to do this. I use my label as bullet because I don't like the thinking. So I'm trying to shoot down all my thoughts as if they are some sort of clay pigeons, like shooting, thinking, trying to get rid of it. So how you apply the label give an indication whether you are acknowledging it or you are resisting the experience. Are you saying the mind needs to be neutral, not clinging or identified to stop suffering, see things as they are without labeling them as good or bad, wrong or right? Maybe, but let's not go so quickly to the end result. Let's start at the beginning and let's try to not to be so concerned of where our mind ought to be. Like he says, needs to be neutral, not clinging, not identifying. Let's not worry about that, okay? Let's be concerned with what is our current state of mind. What is the kind of reactions or absence of reactions in this moment, in this meditation? So let's just come back and be mindful of where we are now at. And not to worry so much about where our mind should be or have to be or need to be. We can forget about that for the moment. Let's come back to our current reality and become acquainted with it and investigate our current experience. Right? Let's do a meditation together. So I invite you to find a suitable posture and just settle your body into that posture. You can be sitting on a chair, sitting on the floor, on a cushion. You can also lie down in the privacy of wherever you are. Feel free to lie down on your back in the supine position. Could be lying on a firm bed or a lounge. You can lie on the floor, but it's good to have some padding. And feel free to close your eyes completely if you find that helpful. And just arrange your body in that posture. So let's start by giving our body some space, some time to adjust itself, to get used to the posture, to find its way into the posture, so that it can, over time, settle down comfortably in this meditation posture. Take care that the back, the spine feels comfortable in the posture, that our posture has not introduced additional or unnecessary pain or discomfort into any part of our back or spine. Rest the hands and arms on some support in such a way that we can allow the shoulder muscles or the arm muscles to be relaxed. Become aware of sensations beneath, sensations coming through the points of contact between the body and the seat, the body and the ground. Let into awareness sensations of solidity, of firmness and stability from beneath us, qualities we tend to associate with the earth elements, with the ground, so that the body feels that it is well supported in this posture. The body feels well balanced and safe. And by doing so, we are trying to promote a natural process of unwinding, whereby the body can loosen up, it can put aside some of those unnecessary contractions and tightening. We're going to make use of the breath as a support in this meditation. So let's start with a few deep breaths. Just breathe in and out a few times. And on the out breath, we remind ourselves to release. We allow the breath to settle back into its natural rhythm. We allow the body to breathe itself, and without trying to control the breath in any way, as much as possible, we rest our attention on the different sensations of the breath within our body. So we may notice sensations around the nostrils, where the air flows in and out of the body. We may sense the movements of the chest, expanding and contracting. Or some of us may even notice the rising and falling movements of the abdomen as we breathe in and out. So the breath will be our support, a place where we can invite our attention to come back to reconnect with the breath sensations. Don't feel that you need to somehow hold on to the breath sensations with your mind, with your attention. Somehow you have to keep focus on it. Instead, think of it as the breath is a support that is always going to be here. At any time during the meditation, we can always invite our attention to come back here and now, to come back and reconnect with the breath sensations. Reconnecting with any of the sensations of the breath within our body. See if we can tune into the sensations of the out breath. Notice a natural feeling of release that comes along with the out breath as we release the carbon dioxide. So breathing out is an opportunity when we can release. We can allow any unnecessary tightness and tension in the body to flow away with the out breath. For example, we can notice whether we are tensing the muscles of our face, as quite often we unconsciously do tense up the facial muscles as we react to what's happening to us. So if we notice any tension in the face, see if we can, on the out breath, as we breathe out, see if we can release some of those tensions in the face and allow our whole face to feel softer, more at ease, and more comfortable. Coming back to the breath sensations, reconnecting with the sensations of the breath, breathing out, making use of this opportunity to deepen the sense of release, helping both our body and our mind to gradually settle into meditation. We allow the body and mind on their own to continue to unwind, to release unnecessary tensions or agitations. So that given time, they can settle more and more comfortably into the meditation. And now for the actual meditation on mindfulness, we are going to practice or cultivate the two aspects of mindfulness, of recognition and acknowledgement. We recognize, become aware of what is happening, where our attention is preoccupied with in this very moment, and we acknowledge it by applying very gently a suitable label to describe it. For example, I suggest you make use of the word sensing. When you notice, when you recognize your attention is present here and now with the breath sensations, with any other bodily sensations, be it noticing tension, tightness, or relaxation, feeling of ease. When the mind is noticing sounds, all of this we can recognize and acknowledge as sensing. And then on other occasions, we become aware that our attention is no longer with sensing. Our attention is involved with thoughts, with images, with words. Could be about the past or the future. Could be with a fantasy or an ongoing inner commentary. See if we can, when we recognize it as such, see if we can acknowledge it by applying the label thinking. And when we have done that, invite our attention to come back to here and now, come back to the breath, come back to sensing. Coming back to here and now, coming back to sensing the breath. Pay close attention to how we acknowledge what is happening, what is unfolding in our meditation. Notice the tone of voice that we use when we apply the label. Notice any other reactions that might stir up as we become aware, as we recognize what is happening within our meditation. So coming back to this moment, to sensing the breath, the bodily sensations, areas of the body that feel tight and uncomfortable, or parts of the body that feel at ease, relaxed, soft, and maybe even sensing the sounds in the surrounding. See if we can recognize it as such and acknowledge with the label sensing. Coming back to the breath sensations, reconnecting with them, reconnecting with sensing. Maybe we become aware that our attention doesn't always stay here and now. Attention is drawn elsewhere. Maybe attention come under the influence of sleepiness, feel heavy, dull, dark. If you recognize it as such, can we acknowledge with a label sleepiness? Or else you may notice that our attention is drawn into thoughts, past, future, fantasy, judgment. Can we acknowledge that as thinking? And in either case, invite our attention, come back to here and now, to the reality of this moment, and continue with sensing. Coming back to sensing, noticing the breath, bodily sensations or sounds, becoming aware of other activities of the mind. Notice how we apply the labor. Are we able to stop at simple recognition and acknowledgement? Or are there other things involved, other reactions? Are we resisting what we find in our meditation? Or are we okay with acknowledging what is happening within our meditation? So coming back to sensing for the last few minutes of this meditation, as you settle into sensing, as you settle into recognizing and acknowledging, see if you can tell, is there any difference? Does it feel different? On occasion when we can simply recognize and acknowledge, and occasions when we have reacted to what is going on. We have resist what is happening in our meditation. Okay, welcome back. Today is a simple meditation on trying out the two aspects of mindfulness, recognition and acknowledgement, and then to see whether in our own experience, at least within the context of meditation, able to discern any difference between simple acknowledgement and resistance, yeah, if there is any. So earlier, Jennifer said that the mind needs to be neutral in order to stop suffering without labeling our experiences as good or bad, right or wrong. I need to qualify it because this is one of the very common when we talk about this topic. On one hand, we put our resistance, our reactions, which tends to involve doing, because that's how usually our reactions manifest, doing something, trying to stay away, trying to stop thinking. And then when we first encounter meditation like this, when we simply ask to acknowledge the fact, the recognition and acknowledgement tends to be associated with not doing. And sometimes this just happens naturally because that's the way you can get the maximum difference between these two states and also makes it easier to differentiate them. So when we react, when we resist, we are trying to do something. When we don't react, we don't resist. When we simply acknowledge and recognize and acknowledge, we are not doing anything about it. Like for example, Guy was saying, we just allow ourselves to nod off. Yeah. True to a certain extent, but not always true, because it's important not to associate recognition and acknowledgement, acknowledging what is happening in reality, with don't equate that with not doing anything about it. In fact, often in real life, the fact that we can see things clearly, we can recognize what is happening, we can acknowledge that fact. Often, that clarity allow us to act on it. Act with clarity will help us in our decision making and choice making. So it is also just equally can be associated with action. But the action comes having first recognized and acknowledged the fact. And the action comes from actually a very different place. In contrast with when we are deep down, we resist what is happening, and then we act from that resistance. So both involve actions. And also, it doesn't mean that to acknowledge something means we cannot evaluate and judge it as right or wrong, or good or bad for that context. The only thing is we try not to jump to conclusion. We try not to prejudge or prematurely jumping to conclusion. Instead, by acknowledging it, hopefully it allows us to investigate, to pay closer attention, to see clearer. And on that basis, we evaluate and come to our own conclusion. Is this right? Is this wrong? Is this helpful? Is this not helpful? So we still come to certain evaluative conclusion as well. Okay, so hopefully you might, in your meditation or other sessions, as you continue to explore this this topic of suffering equal pain, or whatever experience multiplied by resistance, we can explore this further on our own and to reflect whether it is true or not from our own experiences. That and also maybe we can make a distinction from our own experience when we are resisting reality, rejecting reality of this moment, and when we can simply recognize and just acknowledge it for what it is, without resisting, without all the reaction towards it, and see whether, at least from our own experientially, we can make a distinction, and then whether on that basis come to our own conclusion, whether is it true or not that it is precisely because of our resistance to reality that transform it into suffering. In the First Noble Truth, after presenting the 7 items, birth, aging, illness, and so forth, there is a summary, a conclusion to this, which presents the 8th item. And usually in the Buddhist jargon, it's called the 5 aggregates together with clinging are suffering. 5 aggregates together with clinging are suffering. Right? So this is a summary of what the Buddha has talked about earlier: birth, aging, sickness, death, encounter with the unpleasant, separation from what we hold dear, wishes are unfulfilled. So there's no time, and it's too complex a topic, the 5 aggregates. But in this context, I suggest you interpret this word 5 aggregates to refer to each and every one of our conscious experience. The totality of our conscious experience can be included under the 5 aggregates. So each and every one of those experiences, when it is together with clinging, which is really the Buddhist word for resistance, clinging. And there are different forms of clinging. When our experience is together with clinging, then that experience is one of suffering. So this is the summary of the First Noble Truth. And this is the Buddhist way at least for me, this is the Buddhist way of presenting the so-called formula. The suffering is equal to any of our experience multiplied by resistance. And so, according to this formula, the greater we resist that experience, the greater will be our suffering. Especially when we have an experience that somehow deep within us we reject completely. We just can't deal with it. So I will have maximum resistance towards that experience, and that will automatically make the experience as one that we would regard as of great suffering. Okay, so this is one way of understanding the First Noble Truth. And the Buddha has explained that what is required of us as we learn about the First Noble Truth, the action required from us is to understand it, to comprehend it. So for us to individually look at it, we are no stranger to suffering. So for us to investigate in our own way, based on our own life experiences, past or current, and to decide for ourselves whether this is true or not. That whenever we suffer, that suffering is very much tied to how we relate to what is happening. When we relate to what is happening with resistance or with clinging, the Buddhist word, when we somehow deep down within us not able to face up to the fact of that fact as it is, and somehow we feel we need to do something extra to it. We somehow need to repackage it. We need to deny it. We need to, or the opposite is to exaggerate it, not consciously. A lot of these reactions are unconscious. Either we deny that it happened, or we exaggerate into like, the worst thing that ever happened to me, or the best thing that ever happened to me, and then react to the worst or the best with some form of clinging or rejection. Then this very resistance is what creates or compound our suffering. All right, so 1.5 hours spent basically just on one line, just one idea. But I quite enjoy it. I think it's wonderful to have the opportunity to unpack this line, this formula, and to invite each one of us to take a closer look at it. Because for me, I think it makes a lot of sense, and it really helps me a lot in dealing with different situations. Just to give a very mundane example, a few years ago, I moved back to Singapore, hot and sunny and humid Singapore. And when the first few months, when I moved back to Singapore, I really, really dislike the weather. I'm from Singapore, of course, I'm used to it, yeah. But I really, really dislike the weather. It's so hot, it's so humid, and my body tend to respond to it every time I step out of the office or my flat. Walking, I would be sweating, and I really hate that whole experience, walking in the hot and humid weather of Singapore. And whenever I'm with friends, I will complain. I'll say, "Oh, it's so hot. I'm sweating so much. It's so uncomfortable," and blah 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 and blah blah blah. And finally, one day, I exhausted my friend's patience. And being Buddhist, she said, "Well, Wai Chong, what did she say? Sort of, why don't I just wake up and just accept that I'm now in Singapore, and this is what it is." And so after that, I learned my lesson. I shut up. I stopped complaining. It's still hot and humid and uncomfortable, and I still dislike it very much. But as time passes, I make peace with Singapore weather and with my bodily response to it, and actually I suffer less when I finally allow myself to acknowledge it as the fact of my life in Singapore, and this is what it is. No amount of complaining will change it. Instead, I change my behavior. I try to go from one aircon place to another aircon place without, if possible, without exposing myself to the hot and humid weather. So to conclude, I also want to emphasize that when we recognize the fact of life, hot is hot, excellent. When we recognize the fact of reality, and when we are able to fully acknowledge it as what it is from the bottom of our hearts, wholeheartedly acknowledge it, like if it's hot, it is hot. Then this is regardless of whether we like it or dislike it or whatever it is. Yeah. Then this is actually one of the best basis for us to make our choices, to act, because it implies that we are very clear about the actual facts, what is actually happening, what is the reality of that moment. I'm not adding anything onto it, I'm not taking anything away from it, I'm not trying to obscure it, I'm not trying to deny it, I'm not trying to increase or hold on to it, nor am I trying to get rid of it as quickly as possible. I'm simply recognizing and acknowledging the reality of this moment, the only thing that is true in that moment. And this becomes the basis for more effective action and choices. Yeah. Whereas when I instinctively, unconsciously, most of the time, react to what is happening with rejection, then I am adding something extra. I'm actually not seeing reality clearly. And my reactions tends to complicate the situations, escalate the situations, and tend to be ineffective in really dealing with the actual situation, which is why it is suffering. What does RAIN stand for again? Okay, RAIN is a protocol for mindfulness, stands for R stands for recognize, A stands for acknowledge. Other people use other words like allow, accept. I prefer the word acknowledge. I stands for inquire or investigate. And N stands for, in this version that I'm using, N stands for nurture, which means giving the energy of our attention towards. And that involves a choice. What do I want to nurture in this moment? What is most needed and what would be most helpful that I can give my attention to nurture? Right. Okay, so that is my presentation of the first noble truth of suffering. And as the summary goes, 5 aggregates. Every single experience that we have, when we react to it with clinging, this is together with clinging, then that automatically transforms it into a suffering experience. And this is the conclusion of the first noble truth. And the important thing is not whether we buy or not, but it's an invitation to investigate it in our own experience, to maybe recall or notice. It can be current or we can recall the past. Many occasions where when we are able to simply face the facts of reality, just acknowledge it as it is and get on with it. Are we suffering? Or do we suffer less? Whereas on other occasions where we somehow resist the fact, somehow we find it so hard to bear with it, so hard to even to accept it or to acknowledge it, we simply find it too unbearable or it's too unacceptable. And so we instinctively struggle against it, we reject it, we get upset, we get very angry, or we do the opposite, we become very clingy, become very attached. Then are we creating suffering for ourselves? Okay, so with that, I leave you some food for thought on the topic of suffering. And next week, we will continue and explore the second noble truth, on the cause of suffering, all with the objective of coming to an understanding of what is the happiness of liberation, happiness of complete freedom from suffering. What does it really mean, and is it possible for us to accomplish that? So thank you very much for your attention, and wish you to have a good week ahead, and hope to see you next week. All right. Take care. Good night.